this computer. Go. Okay, so once again, welcome to everybody, and welcome to Don. Thank you for agreeing to do this talk for us. As you've all heard, we've been largely talking about how specimens are obtained, but I expect you'll give us some more detail to that in a moment, won't you, Don?
Yes, that's right.
And what I will do is, in a moment, I will mute everybody so that we don't get any interference while you're talking, and you will have to manually unmute yourself.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So here we go. Over to you, Don.
Right. So yep, I've unmuted and I'm now going to the share screen
Mhm.
and maximize that. And hopefully you can now all see the title page.
Yes, I can.
Okay, right. Well, unless you interfere, Mervyn, by saying, oh, something's gone wrong, I'll just press on. And you want to take a break about halfway through, don't you?
Yes, please, if that's okay. We'll have a comfort break for 10 minutes. Yeah.
Right. Again, I'll leave it up to you to interject and state when you want that to take place.
Okay. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for the invitation. It's for me exciting to be able to talk to people who are very much interested in the live specimens, because that's how I came to become a taxidermist, because of my interest in birds in particular and wildlife in general. This all happened way back in the 1960s. So the talk basically is going to center around how I got into taxidermy, the actual process itself, and then I'll give you some various examples and throw in anecdotes as I go along, because actually many of the people that I met are characters in themselves and come up with some interesting stories as they tell you about the specimen they want you to prepare. So this is probably the main source of dead specimens coming to me, was that back in the 60s, I was looking after a number of young birds. When I was at school, a lot of my school friends ended up bringing in birds. A lot of them were farmers, and they cut down a tree, or their parents had cut down a tree and found a bird's nest with young in it. And the children had picked the birds up, and then parents had got annoyed with them for them being around the house, or just didn't know what to do. And because I'd started doing this at about 11 years of age, I'd got a bit of experience. And amongst my school friends had got a reputation for looking after injured birds. It all came about really because I was born with a congenital cardiac condition and I couldn't play sports. And so I'd have to spend my time walking around the sports field, um, just watching my friends play cricket or football, whatever it might be. And I wasn't particularly interested because I couldn't get involved. So I started poking around the hedgerows and really became interested in birds. And this interest was picked up by our local newspaper down in the South Hams. And they ran a couple of articles about me and my interest in birds. And as a byline, they did say that people had started bringing me injured birds, and very often these died. And I'd started experimenting with taxidermy. And so once the word got out, I then had a lot more young and injured birds being brought to me. And from the point of view of the injured ones, if they died, many of the people, when they contacted me to find out how they were getting on, when I told them that unfortunately the individual had died, very often their first comment was, "Oh, it was so beautiful. That's such a shame. You don't happen to know of a taxidermist who might be able to preserve it, do you?" And so that got me interested in having a go myself. And this was one of my very first attempts. And as you can see, it's a female kestrel. And what I've done with this is to go through all the fleshy areas and inject it with formaldehyde, and just allow it to dry out. And the formaldehyde has stopped any decay occurring. And not a particularly attractive looking mount, but it was my first steps and gave me some encouragement towards thinking about what was involved in doing it properly. Problem was that in the 60s, there were very few taxidermists about, and it was not really of any great interest to the majority of people. Whereas these days, it seems to have had a major resurgence. And as somebody was saying just now, there's specimens for sale via eBay and all sorts of outlets. And people pay huge sums of money for these things. So eventually, through sort of looking around, I learned that there was a taxidermist up in the Bristol City Museum. And so from Devon, I wrote a letter there to ask about how one might go about preserving the birds. And this is the response that I got: a very brief explanation, not unsurprisingly, really, and a reference to a book. And all my experience was actually based for a long while on purely what I'd read in the books. I managed to get 2 or 3 books from the library and worked my way through them. And so it's really perhaps down to this taxidermist, who I never actually met, Khalid Ghani, who gave me enough information to actually allow me to sort of move forwards and actually to prepare specimens which looked a lot more like the real thing. Now, in that letter, you can see that there's a few comments there about how you go about preparing it, skinning it, and so on, but the exact detail was missing. So I'll just warn you that the next few images are going to be a little bit gory. So if anybody wants to sort of switch off the screen, then it'd be best you do so now. And I'll tell you when we get back to the more normal images. This is a stoat that was picked up off the road by a friend of mine. And unusually, I decided that because I'd got a request to talk to a Rotary Club do, I'd actually make an attempt to photograph the process. So mammals do not make up a huge amount of my work. I've gone through quite a few over the years, but on the whole, it's birds that I work on. But the process is the same. So you begin by making an incision, basically from the xiphoid sternum, which is the sort of bottom of the central portion of the chest, down across the abdomen, down to the pelvis, the pelvic area, and you try and take out all of the body of the specimen through this hole. And in many respects, the smaller it is, the better, when you've got a mammal which has got perhaps very short body hair, because you don't want the sewing up to spoil the impression that you're giving of a living specimen. So that's the incision there. And of course, one of the things that you can't help but do is notice certain oddities about the specimen. In the very early days, obviously, I didn't really know what an oddity was, so perhaps looked a little bit more closely at every specimen than I perhaps have done in subsequent years. On this stoat, we can see that it's a female, because it's possible to see that she's got her teats very prominent here, and so is almost certainly going to have some youngsters, or have had youngsters very, very recently prior to death. And working on the specimen, I would go in and try and isolate the hips, and then cut the lower limbs or legs at the hip joint, and then cut through the tail, which is just here and would normally be or is actually still attached here, and peel the skin back, to reveal both a cut on the tail, so I can then move further back, cut at the hips, so that I can peel the skin, rather like trying to peel a banana simply by just opening one side of the banana skin and peeling it back around the fruit. So eventually what we end up with is the main part of the body of the specimen and the skin coming off from the head region. And in this specimen, you can see the tail here. It's normally possible to just simply pull the tail out of the skin without having to go along and cut all the way along the base of the tail, and therefore having to sew it back up afterwards.
Don,
It's
can I
usually possible.
interrupt a moment?
Yes,
Um,
sure.
the third picture on that page there,
Hmm.
has it fully opened for you?
Yes, it has.
No, it hasn't for me.
Ah,
No,
what
we-
about the fourth one? Has that
No,
opened?
no,
no.
we're not seeing the bottom part of the picture.
Ah, no, I don't. Let me go back. I'm not sure what might be the problem here. Because I've got it on full screen.
Yeah, and
Uh,
and it's just leaving a blank bit for me at the bottom of the screen.
right. Let me just see if I can. If I end the show and go back to. Can you see anything better there?
Oh, no, we can see the full screen in the bits on the side. If you just click on slide 5 a moment.
So yeah, you want
Ah,
to,
that's interesting because when it's on the full screen, we're not seeing it all. Um, I don't know why that is. In
so
fact,
you
that
can't.
also,
You can only see the images down on the left-hand side then.
yes.
Well,
But
the top
also, I
two.
realise now we couldn't see all of your letter either from the museum in Bristol.
Oh, that's
We
what I
couldn't
was
see.
on about, Mervyn. I can't see it.
Right. I don't know what. Let me stop sharing for a minute.
Yeah.
John, have you got this fully open as a slideshow?
Yes. Well, until I took it down again. Let me
Right.
just try opening it up again. I'll start the share screen. Um,
As I say, when we did the trial run, the full
it
screen was
was
showing, wasn't it?
yes. So that's my basic page. Now, if I go on to the full presentation, you've got the two top images, you say,
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
but you're not seeing the
Ah, we've got,
bottom.
yeah, we're seeing the bottom now.
I
Yeah, I
wonder
can
if
see it.
it's just something to do with the bandwidth and it's taking a while to come through.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we are seeing it now. So if you want to carry on from there, Don.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's right. So yes, on the third image, then we've got the main body of the specimen, the part which would prove most difficult to stop from decomposing, and the skin here, and it's attached at the moment to the body by the base of the skull, and this is where things tend to change a little bit with the more modern taxidermy approach. I would normally cut the neck, the cervical vertebra, and then skin out the skull and use the skull once padded out with a modeling clay or cotton wool or chopped tow, um, and use that. Whereas with many of the modern taxidermists, the former that they'll put into the skin to regain the shape of the original specimen will actually include a head. And so all they're doing is putting the skin over this body. But I usually prefer to keep the skull in one piece. And in fact, at the conference a few weeks back, I was talking to one of the taxidermists there, and they said that with birds like a crow, for instance, they would actually completely remove the skin from the whole of the skeleton. They would then cast up the skull and the beak using resins, and they would then paint the beak and then put the skin back over, and they would have the resin head section with resin beak, and then they would make up a body, or they will have purchased a body to put the rest of the skin over. So there's a few different approaches there with modern day taxidermy. However, originally you always kept the skull. It was an important part of the specimen, because it was the part that really attracted most attention and had to be most accurate. On the right there, the skin, as you can see, it says after washing and preserving. So I've completely removed everything but the skull, and then I've washed the specimen, and I would normally do this in just plain water and maybe use a little bit of soap if necessary. But apparently now they usually just wash all their specimens in fairy liquid. I was always told not to do that because it would remove the vital oils on the feathering, and it just wouldn't look right. So after washing it, I then dry it, and the way I would have and have always done so right up until this day is to use a powder of light magnesium carbonate. So I just throw the wet skin into a plastic bag half full of light magnesium carbonate, which is very much like talcum powder, and shake it all up, and then remove it and blow all the excess powder off, and you get this lovely white fur here, or lovely white feathers if it's a bird. An important step not to miss out, however, is that if you want to do it quickly and effectively, rather than just putting the wet specimen in, you need to thoroughly clean it in acetone. And actually thinking about this a few weeks ago, I came to the conclusion that, of course, using acetone on the specimens would dissolve any oils and grease. So actually using fairy liquid to wash it rather than this process is probably no different. You're removing just the same amount of oil and grease from the skin anyway. So I'm going to give that a try with my next specimen, washing it in fairy liquid rather than going through the process of carefully washing it in clean water and then dousing it in acetone before putting it into the bag of light magnesium carbonate. The modern taxidermist buys many of their bodies upon which to put the skin from professional companies who prepare these things, and this is just a small selection here of bodies which you can purchase, and it's difficult to tell from this whether you're looking at a large dog or a very small dog, but you can see that these have articulated limbs, and the skull is no longer required because they've also molded their head section, and so all you've got to do is skin the animal and pull it back over this. And this is what I'm doing here with this stoat. I decided I would buy one of these prepared bodies and have a go at using it on the stoat. And interestingly, in the very early 70s, I'm sure I wasn't the first to do this, but these bodies are made from brown polyurethane foam. And as I say, back in the 70s, this stuff came onto the wider market. And I very quickly realized that it would be a good way to make up my bodies. If I wrapped the skinned body of the stoat in plaster of Paris bandages, let that set, cut the plaster of Paris so that it could be pulled away from the body in two halves. And if I then used another plaster of Paris bandage to put the two halves together, if I poured in a little bit of this expanding polyurethane foam, it would then take up exactly the right proportions of the body that I'd just removed. Whereas with the old approach, you used to have to wind plumber's hemp or tow around a central wire and try and make the body as close to the original proportions as possible. And so I'm sure I wasn't the first to think of it, but I like to think that I was one of the very first. And I can remember in Plymouth, the supplier for my brown polyurethane foam put up an exhibition of some of my stuffed animals with the bodies I'd made to show the versatility of their product. So here I am starting now to get to the stage where I can close the skin over the body. You can see that there's leg wires, important to be able to move the legs into the right position. There is actually a tail wire in there, although you can't see it because I've cut it to just the right length of the tail so that it doesn't protrude out the end. And then there is also a head wire. And you can see how I've started to use small pins to pin into place some of the important features of the head, such as the ears and the lips. And this is the needle and thread, which I'm using to sew up the incision. And you can see that actually I've had to enlarge the incision somewhat. When I skinned the animal, I was only working on this area here. But to get this preformed body over the skin, or the skin over the preformed body, I had to open it right up to virtually the top of the chest level. So I've sewn up half of the incision here, and then I'm working to finish off by closing it completely. The thread that I use originally just used to be ordinary cotton, and I would use some wax to sort of help preserve it, as it were, give it its longevity, and also to make it easier to pass it through some of the thicker skinned animals. But now what I use by preference is, believe it or not, dental floss. That has got its own sort of coating on it. It moves through the skin quite smoothly, and also it's got a tougher, longer lasting finish to it. The other thing you've got to think about is putting some lifelike eyes into the specimen. And I think there are still people out there who will cast an eye out of resin, transparent resin, and then paint it to get the finish. But glass eyes have been around for donkey's years, and I'm sure that the Victorians were very good at this, preparing glass eyes for their specimens. And so I could never see any benefit of making my own eyes. I would always buy glass eyes. And this is just a range, which, as you can see here, includes human eyes as well. I'm not quite sure why an organization selling natural history products would want to provide human eyes, but there they are. So with my stoat here, not a particularly good photograph, but the blue is some paper that I've soaked in glycerin, and I've stuffed that into the mouth opening just to soften the skin up. You can see I've got glass eyes in place. and you can see pins holding the skin in place as well. And then this becomes more involved as I've, in this case, decided not to have an open mouth. So I don't need to model the tongue and the interior of the mouth. So I've sewn up the mouth, and there's 2 pins here holding that into position, and pins again for the back of the skin around the skull. I've got, just in this case, the sort of ankle and foot bones left in the specimen of the legs, and I've raised the toes up to make it look as though the animal is actually gripping the surface, and put pins in again to help with that as the specimen dries out. Now, you've got to be careful here because there is obviously some flesh around the bones of the foot and the toes. So on smaller specimens, you can probably get away with just leaving them to dry out. But normally you want to, with the bigger specimens, cut an incision into the sole of the foot and pull the tendons and as much of any of the flesh that you find there out, and maybe even inject something like formaldehyde in there just to make sure that you're not going to get any decay in that area. So there's the finished specimen. I've just mounted it up on a piece of plywood, and I've got some artificial grass here, and it's nothing special. Very much like the Victorians would do, an animal standing, looking pretty static, really, and just looking at it from slightly different angles. Not my favoured approach, but because I was working with a pre-prepared body, and also I was working quite quickly through this, I didn't attempt to try and put it into any unusual sort of stance. But that was what really got me noticed as a youngster with my taxidermy, was that there weren't many taxidermists around. So I used to get a lot of contacts through local museums. But also it was the fact that because most of the specimens were roadkills, I needed to put them into rather imaginative poses in order to cover up the abrasions, loss of skin or loss of feathers in certain areas, so that it wasn't clearly visible when you had your initial view of the prepared specimen. And I can remember one of the museums saying that even at the age of about 14, they'd got 1 or 2 people who would provide them with stuffed specimens, but they preferred mine because A, they were more imaginative and were finished off a little bit better than their previous taxidermists, and that worked to my advantage. And the museums used to supply me with quite a lot of work, and I can say that even whilst I was at sort of junior and senior school, I was able to earn decent sums of money to fuel my interest in cameras and photography, whereas a lot of my school friends were totally reliant on their pocket money to be able to save it up and get these things. I was able to shoot film off as rapidly as I wanted because I had a sort of monthly income, if you like, from a couple of the local museums. I won't ask you to guess what this might be, although being ornithologists, you'll probably be able to work this out. But this just shows you what state many of the birds are in after I've finished washing them. Just a sodden mass. There's no body there. You can see a wire coming from the skull, which incidentally I've worked on already. This wire is going in to the base of, or through the base of the skull into the cranium, which I've then packed, even from those early days, with car body filler like plastic padding. And I've normally put the eyes in even at this stage, because what I found early on was that when you put the skin back over the skull, the eyes can be positioned in all sorts of places if you've got nothing other than the orbit for a reference point. So I now tend to cut through the cornea of the eye, and I take out the aqueous and vitreous humor and the lens of the eye, and then I pack that, having first of all just washed it with a bit of preservative solution, which I'll come to in a minute, and then I pack it with clay or car body filler again, and then I put the glass eye into exactly the right position, and then when the skin is folded back over, it can't move too much from its original position. So I've found it a lot easier to actually get the eyes at the right sort of level, left to right, and be able to move them around as they would normally in the orbit, so that the bird or a mammal can actually have its eyes sort of looking slightly to one side, if that's appropriate. So this is the finished specimen. What I was showing you there was a gold crest, and you can see that it's been doused, or from what I've said, it's been doused in acetone, put into a bag of light magnesium carbonate, shaken up, taken out after about 5 or 10 minutes, and then I've shaken all the dry powder light magnesium carbonate off it, blown a lot of what's left free of the feathers, and probably hyperventilated in the process. I usually get quite dizzy at times, and it's only recently that I've bought a compressor so that I can use compressed air to blow all the light magnesium carbonate off. But you can see the eyes in situ here, and they are embedded into the eye itself, which then sits in the orbit. And it's a bit easier again to pull the lids of the eyes around the eye, and if you want to make the eye sort of slightly closed if that's required. This is a little bit of dental floss which I've put through the nostrils and then tied the beak together to stop it from opening up as the main carcass dries out. Now, most of the time when I'm mounting a bird, I've got an idea in my mind as to how I want it to look when I've finished it. Very rarely do I start skinning a specimen without knowing what I want to do with it. And in the case of this little gold crest, this is a photograph I took of a gold crest running around the or flying around the undergrowth alongside a canal where I used to live. And it was a very cold day. It had recently snowed, and this little goldcrest was busy hunting for food. And I got quite a few photographs of it. And when somebody handed in a goldcrest, that's how I wanted to mount it. And you can see it's on a plinth here, which actually is a base to a glass dome. And I've taken a few of the plants, the sort of thistle here that I found in the canal, dusted it lightly with plaster of Paris after having lightly sprayed the plant with a glue, and that gives it the snowy effect, and then mounted the gold crest on that. So you can see just different positions of the bird, and again it in a little bit more close up. And as you will know, this is Europe's smallest bird, and it was very, very difficult to work on this. The process of skinning, as you saw before, involves the whole of the skin being pulled back over the skull. Some people will actually make an incision into the back of the neck and over the top of the skull and work on the skull through that. But I found that you've got to be very careful when you sew that up, because it can alter the way the feathers lie. So I always pull the skin right back over the head. And the only exception for me is with ducks and geese, because their heads are very big compared to the neck. And I have to work very quickly here, because if the skin starts to dry out and shrink, I can't get it back over the skull. And I've come unstuck a couple of times like that with blue tits, which are more frequently handed in rather than gold crests. Not a great deal bigger, but I've sat, casually working through, and I've put it to one side for half an hour, I have a cup of tea and a break, and I come back to it and I find that I can't get the skin to go back over the skull. And I've had to resort to cutting it, and it doesn't end up looking anywhere near as good as keeping the whole of the skin intact. This is another of the specimens, and this is one of the rare occasions where not me, but a friend went out and killed this bird. This, as you can see, is an English grey partridge. And during the hawking season, he used to fly a peregrine at partridge and pheasant. And he always wanted to catch an English partridge, but felt that it wasn't really ethical to do so when their numbers were on the decline. But on one occasion, his hawk was waiting on, and the dog flushed an English partridge, which, as I'm sure you'll know, they tend to hold their position in the ground until the very last minute. So my friend was actually looking at some red-legged partridge in the distance and had put the hawk up and was working the dogs in to flush the red-legged partridge or French partridge. And this one got up much closer too. The peregrine came down, whacked it to the ground and killed it. And he quickly got it away from the peregrine, saying he wanted it stuffed. So this is one of the exceptions where I've worked on something that's been killed rather than died by accident or through illness. And just thrown that in to make the point that when seeking specimens, I'd rather actually work on things that have died naturally, whether it be through disease or through car accidents or injury through flying incidents, flying into wires or whatever, rather than going out and either shooting or hunting something down. And that's more to do with my view of how people view taxidermy. I don't like to think that the impression people get is that a taxidermist will go out and try and seek a specimen come hell or high water to satisfy the demands of a customer. They will sit and they will wait patiently until something appropriate comes their way. And so most of us who are practicing taxidermy get specimens come through museums, from zoos, from wildlife parks or nature reserves, and then to a lesser extent just members of the general public when they become better known. A friend of mine locally, a young girl who is a very good taxidermist after only just 6 or 7 years of working in the business, she gets a lot of specimens from the God, the name's gone out of my head now. Peter Scott's reserve down in on the River Severn. She's had a very exotic range of birds, the last of which was an osprey, would you believe? So we prefer to work on things that have been handed in, and as a consequence, you may end up finding yourself working on people's pets, which is not quite so pleasant. And I'll come to that again a bit later on. Out of interest, I should say to you that I'm not a professional taxidermist. I did work in the 70s almost full time at one stage. But I went into medical imaging. I trained originally as a radiographer, and I did very early on get my own X-ray set, and so rather unusually had a small portable X-ray unit in my garage, and I used to use this to X-ray some of the casualties that came in, and that would help me treat them, because in the 60s and 70s you didn't have many options. There were few vets who were keen to help you deal with wild birds because they weren't going to earn any money from it. So I was lucky. I managed to get the assistance of a local GP, and we did have some of my casualties operated on by doctors who put pins in them to deal with fractures, severe fractures, and a couple of veterinary surgeons who also would work on some of my casualties for me. And the X-ray unit was quite useful to assess the bird when I first received it and pass it on. But it was also quite good for this purpose, to give you an idea of what the specimen looks like when it's been stuffed and mounted. You can see the main body wire going from the skull down through what would be the neck, the body, and out at the tail end. You can see the wing bones are still in position, the skull's in position, as are the leg bones here. And then we've got a series of wires supporting these, in particular the leg wires. So these are fed up through the legs, hopefully not rupturing the skin at any point, and then they are inserted into the prepared body and anchored in place so that the bird will stand on its own two legs, as it were. And this mass here is the car body filler, which I've used inside the eyes in order to, as I say, make sure I can get the eyes in the right position. This is a skeleton that I preserved. I didn't do a lot of work like this, but one of the zoos, Paynton Zoo down in Devon, wanted me to do a few skeletons for them, and this was one of the first. It was a shelduck, and it was rather interesting because I spent a bit more time looking at the bony anatomy, not surprisingly. One of the things which when you look at anatomy and talk about comparative anatomy becomes very obvious is that humans, along with mammals and birds and reptiles, share a lot in common as far as our anatomy is concerned. And when you're working on a skeleton, you start to notice some of the major differences. So I've just put in here a bit of identification. We've only really got 3 main digits of the hands left in the wing of a bird. And so this is really the sort of carpal and metacarpal and phalangeal region of our hands. This is the radius and ulna of the wing, and this is the humerus going into the shoulder joint. When we look at the legs, one thing that as a taxidermist you quickly note is that the knee joint is virtually within the body of the bird. Unlike ourselves, they don't tend to have not easily visible anyway. The femur tends to be held very close to the body, and what we tend to see most of the time is the tibia and fibula, and then from here down we're looking at the tarsal bones. And as we know, that there are a variety of ways in which the phalanges on the birds can present, but not there's more of them. It looks much similar to the human foot than the hands do to the wing of a bird. Some other differences that are very obvious are the way the clavicles are fused, and the sternum itself has this keel to it, which enables the huge flight muscles to be attached, providing the strength to be able to beat the wings and get the bird to lift off the ground. Now, one of the things that surprised me is the cervical vertebra. And I can remember at school, one of the first times that we studied anatomy in a sort of very informal way at junior school. We were told that it didn't matter whether you had a long neck like a giraffe or you had a short neck like a mouse. There were 7 cervical vertebrae. And it was only later, when I started doing taxidermy and looked into this, that I found there was a huge difference in the number of cervical vertebrae present in the neck of a bird. With almost every other animal, there is normally only 7 cervical vertebrae, whether it's a giraffe or whether we're looking at a small mammal like a mouse or a stoat. I think the only exception is a certain species or subspecies of sloth, and I think they tend to have 2 or 3 more cervical vertebrae than other mammals. But in a bird, can be anything between 10 and 26 cervical vertebrae, depending on the species. So that was quite a surprise, really. And that's again another joy, going into the sort of medical field as I did. I had a good head start to my fellow students when studying, because I already knew quite a bit about the anatomy, the skeletal and the muscular anatomy of the birds, as well as from time to time taking the time to look more closely at things like the heart, the liver and the kidneys. So I'd done a lot of dissection just out of interest. Now, in terms of the work I did, as I said to you, most of it was when I was a youngster in my early teens or just pre-teens through my teenage years. And it was very local work. And I did, as I showed you with the first slide, get a bit of publicity through the newspapers. I also got featured on the television a couple of times, as this telegram shows. This was a telegram from Sue Lawley in the early 70s. You can see 17th of November 1970 on the telegram stamp, wanting me to ring her and have a chat. And there were a couple of things that came out of this. One is that she interviewed me for Spotlight Southwest, which was one of the local Southwest of England news programmes. And also I got an offer to act as a sort of host to a programme that they were going to do on vets. And they were going to call this Pets and Vets, and they thought someone like myself would make an interesting and I guess sort of something like a very young David Attenborough type approach, or like you see with Graham Hall and his dogs behaving very badly type approach to introducing the experts and what they do. Unfortunately, I ended up in hospital having major cardiac surgery, and I had to turn down that offer. And by that time, after I recovered from that, I'd become even more interested in the medical side of things. And so by the end of the 70s, I was doing very little taxidermy, and I was studying to be a radiographer, and then going into to lecturing in medical imaging and radiographic and radiological anatomy. But that was very useful in at that time, because it got me known even more widely, and suddenly I was getting lots of letters and phone calls asking me to take on taxidermy. And I lived down in the South Hams, and I was doing work up to this area of the country throughout the southwest, up to sort of Oxford region, for various museums and individuals. And it meant that when I was a student, I'd got money coming in again. I didn't have to go out and work in a bakery or in the post office at night like many of my friends did. I could do this in the comfort of my flat and feel fairly comfortable and also confident about the fact that I'd got this support. So I was very lucky there. And I was also very lucky that my landlord, the flat that I lived in, was a GP. And actually the son of, and some of you may know of Leonard Hurrell and his father, H.G. Hurrell, who were Leonard Hurrell was a GP, but his father was a naturalist, did a lot of work studying animals, and they opened up another world to me. H.G. Hurrell, I used to go out and visit him on Dartmoor, and he had a whole range of animals from ravens, a grey seal, a pine marten clan, all wandering around wild in his garden or swimming pool. And so it helped me observe these things and make sure that what I was doing was more lifelike than just simple poses. And got me into falconry as well. So from the 70s onwards, I also found that I was very rarely without a falcon or a sparrowhawk to fly, partly through rehabilitation work, and then also just out of interest, people would offer me birds to fly if they found that I'd not got anything at that particular point in time. Paignton Zoo, I said, was one of my sources of specimens, and they had a harpy eagle there. And being interested in birds of prey, this was something that I was rather unkindly thinking of. Well, it'd be great to get that when that dies. And about the same time that I saw this harpy eagle alive in the aviaries at Paignton Zoo, I'd been up to visit my grandparents who lived in Leicester. And for the very first time, I met a real living taxidermist. They took me to the Leicester City Museum, and we were looking at the specimens there, and there was a curator walking around. So I asked them if they had a resident taxidermist, and if so, could I meet them? And to cut a long story short, I met these two aged taxidermists. They used to work in their professional paid life as taxidermists for a very famous taxidermy studio called Roland Ward's. And they had worked on all these big game specimens that the big game hunters of the sort of 20s and 30s used to bring back from abroad. Highly experienced individuals. And I spent a day with them, and that was a point where I think I probably turned a corner and found that my life could be made a bit easier through having seen how things were done rather than reading it all through books. And this gentleman, Ted Barrow, in his 80s, said to me when we parted at the end of the day I spent with him, he said to me, you talked about the harpy eagle. He said, if that bird dies and you get it, he said, I want to work on it. I've never worked on one, and I'd really like to be able to do so. And he said, it requires specialist knowledge. And he followed that comment up with this letter. just reminding me that he would do anything to work on this if it did die. And as you see here, he would have paid all the carriages and done it for free for me, just to get that experience. Now, at that time, I'd started to work on larger specimens, and this is a fox that I'd worked on, one of my first as a complete fox. I'd done a number of fox heads before. At that time, fox hunting was legal, and living in the country, from time to time, people would approach me and ask if I could mount a fox's mask for them. But rarely was the fox complete, as you can imagine. This was one that was picked up off the road and in very good condition. And this, I made the body out of foam to start with, and then I cast it in glass fibre and put the skin back around a glass fibre mould. And looking, I'm sorry this is in black and white, but this is actually work that I've done. I've put a tongue and rebuilt the gums and the interior of the mouth in order to make it look like a fox that's being pursued and is just turning back to see what's happening behind him. And again, this sort of thing went down well with the museums, and one in particular, the Torquay Museum, had a school's museum service, and they used to have a lot of specimens that they would pass out to the schools, because they were keen for youngsters to actually handle the specimens and get a feel more for wildlife. And in fact, their head of department, he was called Les Jackman, and I didn't know it at the time, but he was one of the team that formed the BBC Wildlife Unit. And he used to get me involved as a teenager, going around to some of the local schools and a couple of the reserves like Slapton Lee, taking school children round and talking to them about wildlife, and generally, again, giving me the opportunity to see wildlife in all sorts of different situations, and getting more of a feel for what they should look like once I'd finished working with them, rather than a very stilted stuffed specimen. As I said, through the TV appearances, I got more widely known, and this is where some of the characters started to come in to get phone calls or letters. And this is from a couple who had a peacock, and unfortunately, the thing, as the letter said, got tempted out into the road by some workmen and got knocked down by a car. And they wanted to know if I could prepare it for them. And I was keen to help them out. It was another challenge, again, rather a big bird, and so again a challenge in more ways than one, with the way the peacock displays its tail. And I discussed it with them and agreed that I would mount the bird up, and I would mount it up displaying its tail as it would do if it was courting a peahen. And again, the local newspaper came along and took a photograph of this. They would phone me up from time to time and ask what I'd been up to, and so I would let them know what I'd got, and they'd perhaps come out and again do a short article. And so this is the peacock, and me at the time sat alongside it. I've got a rather poor picture of it in colour, and one of the things you'll note here is that actually its tail is not displayed as you would expect it to be if it were courting a peahen. It's at the sort of 9:10 position, and this is because I did originally get the tail fully displayed. I had to put in a large wire hoop and then wire each of these feathers to it to hold them in place while the skin dried out. I contacted the people to tell them that their peacock was ready for collection, and it was only then that the penny seemed to drop with them that they'd got a large specimen on their hands. And they turned up in a Volvo to start with, Volvo estate, to pick it up, had to come back with a horse box, and then decided that it was too big to go in the house. And after some measurements, they decided that if I could rearrange the tail to this position, they could perhaps squeeze it into an alcove somewhere. And so I had to redo the tail, which was a bit tricky because it had dried out. So I had problems trying to soften the skin up and do it without splitting the skin. And all of this for the princely sum of £30, which obviously in the 70s was worth a lot more than it is now, but even then was quite cheap. But after all that effort, they did try and knock me down, and unfortunately, on several occasions, I had people who made quite excessive demands, and then when it came to paying, again, were quite demanding in, oh, that's too expensive. And I think being a schoolboy didn't help, that felt that it was too much money for a youngster to have. But I was still well below what the professional, if you could find them, would charge. Now, one of the things Mervyn asked me to do is make some reference to anatomical features and interesting things that you find out through taxidermy. And obviously I've started that through looking at the skeleton of a bird. And there are obviously lots of adaptations in species as you go through the animal kingdom, which fits them for a particular environment. And one which fascinated me very early on was that of the green woodpecker. Believe it or not, I've had several green woodpeckers to preserve, never had a great spotted woodpecker. Anyway, I'm sure it's much the same with the great spotted woodpecker as it is with the green woodpecker. As you all know, they've got a long tongue, which they need for sticking into holes in trees and pulling out their food, their insects and so on. They go anting regularly in my garden, and this is a green woodpecker that regularly comes down and works its way around my garden. I normally see it every day. This is not the same green woodpecker. This is one which was handed in to me, and I was asked if I could prepare this. And it's interesting to note how the tongue is arranged in the skull. Now, this I've done specially for yourselves. I had a green woodpecker in the freezer, so I took it out and just quickly skinned it out, and the skin is now back in the freezer, waiting for me to finish the process. But you can see the orbit with the eye in place, and as I said before, what I will do is cut the cornea here and extract the contents of the eye itself and put a glass eye in on either side. Here is a groove running along the top of the skull, so coming over the frontal bone and along between the parietal bones and down over here into the occipital bone, down to the neck. And this is where the tongue is situated. I've extracted the tongue from this specimen, and this is the length of the tongue from the tip right through to the base of the tongue. So around 190 millimeters long. That's 19 centimeters long. And for those of you who are a bit squeamish, you'll want to look away now, because I've got a video which I've taken to show you exactly the positioning of the tongue as I excise it from the skull. So here's the video. And is that playing all right, Mervyn?
Yes, that's playing fine. Yep.
Right. So here's the underside of the skull, and the scalpel's going in, cutting either side of the tongue as it rests between the two mandibles of the jaw. And I'm pulling the tongue out as you would expect to see it if you opened the bird's bill. So there's a long cylindrical tongue, sort of going to a point, and that's what you see popping out of the beak and going into the crevice of the tree. But the tongue itself, enabling it to protrude out so far, actually goes back either side of the cervical vertebrae, round the base of the skull, and then over the top of the skull into that groove which I showed you. And you can see there's a section of the tongue running up both left and right sides of the cervical spine, joining together at the base of the skull and then running in that groove. And I can then pull that out from the insertion, which is in the base of the right nostril of the green woodpecker. And I'm going to put this alongside the measuring scale again, just to show you that I hadn't stretched it out excessively to try and exaggerate its length. You'll see me pulling it out and laying it along the ruler again. So you can clearly see the skull. You can see where the skin is still attached to the base of the beak, and the whole of the skin is running off to the left of your screen. And this is the bird's skull, the cervical vertebrae, and this is part of the thoracic region, the thorax of the bird. And here I am just laying the tongue out along the scale to show you it doesn't require any stretching to show that length. So as the bird pulls it or pokes its tongue out, this is all stretching to allow this long cylindrical section to come right out of the beak and probe down deep into the crevices. So I'll close that and go on to the next slide, so anybody who wasn't looking can look back again now. So here's another letter from Paignton Zoo. I'd been asked by them at various times with different people in different departments about taxidermy, and this is one of the letters I'd got. You can see from this that they're sort of making comments about the amount of work they've got, and you know, how they had been given my name by the Torquay Schools Museum Service, and could I help them out, and saying that they've got all sorts of things. They did say they didn't very often have big specimens, so I wouldn't be sent an elephant to work on, which, as you can imagine, was quite a relief. Although I did say to them that if they lost a lion or a leopard or a tiger, I'd be happy to try that, on the basis that it would be like a rather large dog, and I got a little bit more experience at that level. I had quite a range of things from them, from porcupines to sungazer lizard. But one of the first sort of exotic specimens, rather than what I considered to be rather run-of-the-mill, which is different birds that they'd got there, was a colobus monkey. And again, I took it on the basis that it wasn't a lot larger than a fox or a small dog, so surely I could manage that. I think about the only thing I ever turned down from them was a marabou stork. I remember going there one afternoon when they asked me to come along and take away a few things. They opened up the freezer and pulled out these various things, and I looked at the marabou stork, and they have always been a rather off-putting bird as far as I'm concerned, and I didn't quite fancy trying to have to replicate what looked like a saw-ridden face and that respirator that sort of seems to hang down in front of their breast. So I declined to take that, but I accepted the colobus monkey. And again, these are not very good photographs. I think these were probably hastily taken on my mother's camera rather than mine. But that's the monkey, and that's my mother cradling it there. You can see it's got this huge, long white tail. And again, I've tried to do a more exotic pose with its mouth open and the tongue visible. And so that was quite a challenge as well. And again, I made a glass fiber body for this to make sure that it was light and robust. So again, they could take it and use it when dealing with school parties visiting, and not worry about it falling apart if the school children got a bit excited with it. Another thing which has been quite a challenge is working on things like tortoises and turtles. The first time I ever had to cut through the carapace of a turtle was when I was faced with a leatherback turtle. This had been washed up alive down in Cornwall, had been rescued by an individual who managed to put it into a large pond somewhere and got an aquarium in Torquay interested. They sent a tank down to collect this specimen, and with the hope of being able to put it in their aquarium. But it died, not surprisingly, and they wanted me to go along and prepare it for them. We had a long discussion, and I said, well, there's not much that I feel I can do. This thing was over 7 foot long by about 4 foot wide. And I just didn't have the experience at the time. This was again about 1972. I didn't have the experience to be able to think about skinning out, and as you can see in this tortoise that I've worked on here, skinning out the head, the neck and the limbs, and then filling them to make them look realistic. So what I suggested to the museum, to the aquarium, was that I'd happily come along. I'd saw through the carapace, get inside the thing, and I would remove the contents of the shell, leaving the head, neck, and limbs in situ, and then they could put it in a vast vat of formaldehyde, and on leaving that for several weeks, they could then remove it and let it dry out. And so I agreed to do it on that basis. And I was quite surprised that about 15, 20 years ago, I went to that aquarium and it was still on the concrete plinth in the middle of the aquarium on show. But the real story behind it was that I was driven out to the aquarium on the Torbay seafront, and this thing was out at the back of their aquarium, and throughout the day I worked on it with saws and large knives which they kindly provided, and worked on after they had closed. Now luckily it was the summer, so it was quite warm, and I was there until about 7 o'clock at night, and they simply said to me, when you finished, just put all the knives and the saws on the back doorstep, and we'll then sort out the removal to the vat of formaldehyde. So there I was at 7 o'clock at night at this aquarium, which had closed down, and I was in jeans and a t-shirt, which of course by now was totally covered in blood. And got no way of getting cleaned up before a friend came to pick me up to take me back home. I walked along the seafront at Torbay to the public toilets, covered in blood, walked into the public toilets, and at that time they still used to have an attendant. I walked past the attendant, who just totally ignored me, and I stripped down to my underpants and put my t-shirt and jeans into one of the basins and washed them off as best I could, and then put them back on and walked out again, and eventually got collected and taken home. But would you believe it? Nobody said a thing. The attendant in the toilets there didn't question me or refuse me access. He was probably terrified out of his life, actually. But nobody offered any assistance. Are you all right? Have you been in an accident? I don't think it would have happened quite like that these days. So here's a close-up of this tortoise, which was a little bit easier to work on. I skinned this out, and then I worked on the head and the limbs very slowly, packing them with car body filler and cotton wool, which gave me something like 10 or 15 minutes as I worked back, sort of basically about a centimetre at a time, squeezing the skin to get the wrinkles in so that it looked a little bit more realistic. And so managed to finish that off. And the owner was over the moon. It was an elderly gentleman who'd had it since 1940, and he was very pleased to have it back. And I found this with a lot of people. They have pets, and they don't want to lose them, so they have them stuffed, and they're still quite pleased to have them back. I've got one or two of the birds that I've looked after over the years. I've got a kestrel which I had for about 5 or 6 years, but I didn't feel overly comfortable about skinning it out, and it's not really my favourite specimen. I've kept it for various reasons, but I wouldn't really want one of my pets stuffed and mounted. But this is the internal anatomy of a tortoise. You can see the reference. I've taken this off the internet. It's not a photograph that I've prepared, but you can see the shells being cut away, and they've shown the way in which the upper limbs and the lower limbs are attached to the vertebra, which run along the top of the carapace here, and the way the cervical vertebrae go back into the shell. And when working on this, I actually cut my finger on one of the vertebrae because they were quite sharp, and so you have to be careful with these things. There are not very many diseases that you can contract from birds and animals, but obviously we're learning more about that as the years go by. But nonetheless, obviously there are sort of infections and so on that can arise. So I try to deal with these things very quickly with a good cleaning of the wound, and most of the time, of course, you're wearing gloves, and it's only if something's very sharp that it'll penetrate through the gloves. Now, I think if you want a break, Mervyn, it might be as well to do it now. I'm not sure what time it is.
It's 5 to 9. So should we have a break for 5 minutes or so and then give it? Will you be able to get through in about 25 minutes, half an hour
Yes.
after the break done? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. We're sort of coming towards the end of the stuff, I think, now.
Okay. So if we just stop for 10 minutes to get a drink, so it's we'll come back at 9:05. Is that okay?
Okay. Yep. I'll minimize this, and then we'll come back to it in well, I'll come to you in about 5 minutes then, and
Okay.
then that'll make sure it's all working before everybody else rejoins.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to nip and get a drink then, Don. All right.
Yes, I think I'm going to do the same.
Okay. Won't be a moment.
Thank you.
I expect
So
you wanted a drink there, didn't you, Don?
I did, yes. I've got water with me, but I thought I need to go to the loo as well.
Yeah.
Is that going all right? Have you got any feedback?
At the moment, there aren't any questions in the chat, but I'm afraid I'm building up quite a few questions.
Oh, right. Okay.
Well, I say I'm afraid.
No, it'd be good to have a few
Yeah,
questions.
yeah.
It is really good, interesting stuff. I've always had an interest in taxidermy. When I was at school, a careers advisor asked me what I was interested in, and basically it was wildlife, birds and wildlife. And the only job he could come up with was a trainee taxidermist at the Natural History Museum,
Oh, wow.
which I didn't take up. But that point you just made about infections and things, some years ago, I did a road trip in the USA from Baltimore down to Florida. One of the things I sort of resolved to look out for was roadkill on the sides of the road, particularly things like armadillos. But I was told in the case of armadillos, if you see one, by all means have a look at it, but do not touch it because they carry leprosy.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I've heard that they
Wow.
carry leprosy.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Mm. So next time somebody brings you an armadillo,
Yes, I'll refuse it.
yeah.
Well, it's a bit of an issue at the moment, with bird flu.
Yep.
What generally is the case that you treat every bird as though if the individual can't account for how it died, so if they just came across it in a field, assume that it's got bird flu. And so we're told double bag it, put it into a deep freeze for 2 weeks. And after that period, you should be okay. But I had a blue tit in my shed a couple of weeks ago, and the shed door was open, and it had obviously been in there for some time. And as I walked in, it was fluttering up against the window pane and didn't seem to want to go out the door. So I caught it up, and it just sat in the palm of my hand, and it was obviously panting. So I thought, oh, this is probably due to the exertion of trying to get out through the window. But after 4 or 5 minutes, it was still panting. So I went outside and moved my hand up and down with a view to getting it to open its wings and fly off, but it didn't. So I moved it round and opened the doors of the conservatory and put it in there and went off for 10 or 15 minutes. I came back and it was still sat in the same place, but it wasn't panting any longer. But what I noticed was it had passed what looked like a blooded mute. And so I thought, oh dear, that doesn't look good. With that, it started to fly and it went up against one of the windows, and I managed to shoo it out through the open doors, and it did fly up into the trees. But I did wonder there whether that might not have been a case of bird flu.
Were there any discharges from the nose or
No, I couldn't
no?
see anything there. It was just that blooded mute which worried me really.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether um, it affects the GI tract in any way. Um, sometimes if we get flu, it can cause a bit of bleeding,
Yeah,
nosebleeds,
yeah,
and so on, and you sort of swallow that. But no, I
yeah.
don't know.
But I think blood like that probably indicates something quite bad, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah. Well, that I look after these things. I had a couple of swallows this year,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I just thought to myself, "Oh, here's yet another casualty that's going to take up a bit of time." But once I saw that, and then it did start flying without panting, I thought, well, I think maybe the better thing to do here is, get it out as quickly as possible.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there has been a lot of cases of bird flu in passerines.
Ah, it's
But
mainly the ducks and geese, is it?
yeah, yeah,
Or
or birds
fowls
that
generally.
breed in close proximity to each other, in
Oh,
colonies.
so rooks and could get it, could they more readily?
More readily, but I'm thinking more about, seabirds that nest within reach of each other, within pecking
Yeah.
distance and stuff like that. So,
Ah,
yeah, they seem to have suffered. Yeah. But yeah, like I say, I've not consciously seen or handled a bird that I've thought has got flu.
uh-huh.
I mean, it is quite surprising with the number of birds that we handle, how few sick birds you do actually see, and most of it will be things like feather mites that affect birds and stuff like that. So,
Yes, yeah,
or maybe some viral infections of feet, which I expect most people have seen on their bird tables as well.
yes. Well, I've got a friend who's an entomologist, lives over in Winchcombe, and as soon as he knew that I'd got swallows nesting, and it was a nest, as you know, it was in a nest box as opposed to
Yes,
a proper
yeah,
swallow's nest. He said to me, "Oh, when you clean it out, capture the complete contents because I'll go through them and look for various mites and insects." And so I've captured that nest for him and I'll take that over at the weekend.
yeah, Yeah. I mean, the load of parasites in some nests is quite incredible.
Yeah.
I got a license to collect nests for a student from Bristol University who was studying the parasite load. And I mean, it is just incredible and these were in blue tip boxes, and they were cleaned out annually. So each year it was a new load of parasites coming in, and the nests were full of stuff, absolutely
Yeah.
full. But of course, nowadays they use quite clever things. Instead of sitting there and sifting through them, they put them through one of these eDNA testers or whatever, and just come up with a list of what's in there based on the DNA that they extract.
Oh, right. So it's not as mucky as it used to be then.
No, I don't think he got his hands dirty at all.
Right.
Yeah,
Shall we
yeah, we
move
should
on?
push on. Yes, please.
Right. Okay. And I think I'm on the sharing bit. Allow.
Yeah,
So
you're there.
you right, and I'll go up to.
That's it.
Yep. So obviously, we mentioned at the very beginning, before getting into the talk about legislation, and going back in time again, I originally had to get licensed as a taxidermist, and so this is a copy of the license that I'd got, and sorry, it's gone back a bit quicker than I thought. Oh, wrong way. If you look at that, it's got a list of things which I have to be aware of as far as the Act is concerned. And it just amused me that I had a license to sell dead birds or parts thereof. And the whole process revolved around me identifying where the bird came from or the animal came from, um, allotting a number to it or allocating a number to it, and then every year sending that record in together with whether the specimen had then been prepared and moved on to anybody as a mount. And as I said to you early on, one of the specimens that I'd had from the early 80s, I wanted to sell, and they didn't keep these records. And it was the onus was on me to trace the person who gave me the goss in the first instance and get them to verify the fact that, yes, they'd imported it from Germany and I could have a CITES license to sell it. And I understand now that if I want to become a taxidermist and sell birds, I can keep it very casual and apply for individual Article 10 licenses. But if I register as a taxidermist because I'm working professionally, then the mere possession of the Schedule 1 specimen needs to be under an Article 10 license. So you bring me a sparrowhawk and I'm a registered taxidermist, I would then need an Article 10 straight away, rather than waiting until I wanted to sell it. So I'm quite pleased that I'm not a registered professional taxidermist, that I am just doing it on a hobby basis, because it seems there's an awful lot of paperwork involved. And from my experience talking to the officials, a lot of problems interpreting the Act in a way which everybody will be satisfied with. Anyway, moving on from that. So I used to form a log of everything that came through my hands so that I could trace it. And this is just a picture of me working on a stag's head, and the deer stalker is there just for effect. My partner at the time, she came out to take the photograph, and she said, "Oh, if you're going to work on the stag's head, you need your deer stalker to make it look more realistic." But you can see some of the tools of the trade here. There's some cotton wool, there's some eyes upon resin, which is a car body filler, and there's bits of skin which I've cut off where I've mounted the prepared skin at this stage on the former, ready for it to be finished off, and then the whole thing attached to a plaque so that it can be mounted on a wall. And this was a nice 12-pointer stag which somebody shot up in Scotland, and they brought it down, all done appropriately. So I was able to work quite easily on this, and it didn't raise any problems. But more recently, I had somebody bring a stag's head to me, somebody who'd shot the stag, was in many respects a professional, because they bred deer as well. And I understand later on that they trade with the well, are now King Charles rather than Prince Charles deer. And yet when he shot this thing, he just folded the skin and the head and neck up in a corner of a room which was coolish, and left it for 3 weeks before contacting me. And so I started work on it, and then quickly found that around sensitive areas like the eyes and round the nose and mouth, the skin had slipped. The process of decay had started to take place, and the fur was just sliding off the deeper layer of the skin. And basically there was not much I could do with it. But this is the one you saw me working on in the previous picture, mounted up on a plaque, and ready for passing back to the individual who originally shot it. And what interested me here was the glands. They have some secretions from these glands, and when they're rubbing their heads, apparently, this leaves a mark, a scent mark on vegetation. And I presume that's in addition to anything that comes from urine and feces, which many animals also use for marking out territory. Gives you an idea of the size of it again. And I was quite pleased with this. This was my very first stag's head. And again, a glass fibre body, or former, I'd made for that, using the original head and neck as the basis for forming that. And this is what you would do nowadays. You'd measure up the distance from the corner of the eye here to the tip of the nose, and from the tip of the nose to the back of the skull, and give these measurements to the provider of a former. And again, you can then completely skin it out, put that over the former that they've sent you. You'll probably have to do a bit of packing to get it right, but they will have put in a block of wood in the middle of this polyurethane former. So when you have cut the section of skull with the antlers on it, you can screw that in, and you've got a relatively lightweight finished specimen, whereas the glass fibre one would be a little bit heavier. This is a gecko that somebody was demonstrating to me how to make a mold and then cast it up in resin and paint it rather than skin it out. I've in the past, even with reptiles, I've skinned them and mounted them in the conventional way, but it's very arduous, and somebody who is very good as an artist can make the cast specimen look as good as the real thing. Now, when this was being taken out of its mold, he lifted the tail, and it actually came away from the body. And as you know, lizards and various other reptiles can shed the tail. Snakes, I don't think, do it, but a slow worm does, which isn't a true snake, is it? I've forgotten actually the classification there.
It's
but
a lizard.
it is a lizard, is it? Right.
A legless lizard. Yeah.
And they shed the tail, and I was just intrigued to see, because I've never looked at it closely before. When I've had a lizard shed a tail, it's always been a living specimen, and it's one that I've as a youngster I picked up when it was sunbathing, and so I immediately put it back down and it skittered off. But look at the arrangement here, and if I put the tail end, again, you can see the arrangement of the muscular tissue around the central spine, and the way it must separate is amazing, because it doesn't give rise to any significant blood loss at all. So it's not jeopardizing the future of the animal. And I'd not looked at this in detail before, but it just demonstrates the sort of things that come to your attention when you're working on specimens. I was talking about some of the characters. I've had various drama groups contact me asking if I've got specimens that I could loan to them for various performances they're doing. And this was one which involved a gull. That wasn't too difficult to do, but it wasn't one of these things that you really want to spend too much time on it, because you think if they want a dead replica, and I believe, I've never seen the play, but apparently they pull this thing off the wardrobe from somewhere before it's been stuffed. So you think it's going to be manhandled and probably badly handled, and so the effort you put into it is perhaps going to be somewhat wasted. But I did I used a standard gull for them. I didn't go into anything really exotic. I think it might have been a lesser black-backed gull rather than a herring gull that I used. This was a bit more bizarre. A gentleman saying that he got a rocking horse which had a 12-hand pony skin mounted on a wooden frame, and due to the fact that he was regularly riding it, the skin had been somewhat worn, and could I do something to replace this, repair it for him? Just seems bizarre to think of this chap riding a rocking horse, a grown man doing it. And funnily enough, I used to be a ardent watcher of Morse, and on one of the showings of that, they go to a large manor house, and they're interviewing a retired major or something, and he sat aboard this rocking horse in full cavalry dress, riding this rocking horse. And of course, Morse and Lewis are very dismissive about the character, and I thought, yeah, I wonder whether they modelled this on the guy that was wanting his rocking horse all those years ago repaired, or whether there's a number of military gentlemen out there who regularly ride stuffed rocking horses.
Mm-hmm.
So again, ordinary people for the best part of the time, but with some slightly eccentric habits or hobbies. Now, most of my birds, when I was younger, were fairly plainly mounted. I didn't go into a lot of time creating exotic backgrounds for them. So this is a tawny owl that I've worked on here. You can see that I've sawn off the top of a fence post and stapled a bit of barbed wire to it. Have got a little snail inside with a bit of dried grass inside the decaying top of the fence post. But that's about as far as I went, because I didn't have a great deal of time to spend on these things. And also, a lot of the time, people wanted something fairly simple because they didn't have the space to handle an exotic diorama. But more recently, I've started doing things on a larger scale. And as I said, I like to have a bit of a story behind the mounts, make them look alive. And these are two young magpies that were brought to me. These were game control gamekeepers controlling them. So these two, again, I have to admit, were killed, but not at my request. He knew somebody who he was talking to about magpies and the fact that he was catching them or shooting them, and they said, "Oh, if you got one or two, I know somebody who might be interested in them." So I made up this mount. I've got the two magpies, and here is a blackbird. This juvenile blackbird flew into my garage window and killed itself. And surprisingly enough, each year, between myself and several of the neighbours, there are 3 or 4 young juvenile blackbirds dead at the base of a window. So even with relatively small windows, they do seem to fly into them and kill themselves. But I try to make things interesting. This is artificial grass. You can't see it very well in the picture here, but I've actually made out of latex a plantain and put that in the middle of the grass here. You often find them on a lawn. Some ivy, which I actually bought. This is plastic. And also what I've done is I've preserved a fly and a few eggs to put into the abdominal cavity of the blackbird, so that it just injects a little bit more realism if anybody's looking at these things closely. But this brings up another observation, and these young magpies, when you look closely at the feathering, you could see these marks on the feathers, and you can see that they're occurring across the flight feathers here, the secondary feathers, at a particular distance. And these are what are called trace or fret marks. And we used to see this very commonly in young birds of prey or juvenile birds of prey, which were brought in as rescue birds, if not casualties, dead and dying. They, for some reason, have had interruption to their normal diet or some sort of shock to the system, which has upset metabolism as the feather's developing. And these trace marks, you can see them quite clearly, and they form a weak point on the feather. And so if you see a bird flying around with tatty looking wings, it's quite possible that, like this magpie, they've had an interruption to the growth of the feather, creating a weak point, and the feather will break, and the damage then is readily visible. And as a falconer, if the break is quite severe and occupying a larger area of the flight feathers or the tail, what we would do is we would cut the feather back much closer to the root, where the quill of the feather is much thicker, and then we would take a small steel needle called an imping needle, and we glue that into the feather as it came out of the bird's skin and into the new feather that you were going to replace the broken one with. And I did have at one stage a sparrowhawk, which was brought to me with a very badly damaged tail feather, a live bird. And to give that a fighting chance, I imped the whole of the tail, and the only feathers that I had to give it a complete tail were those of the jackdaw. So I had a sparrowhawk, which until it molted out at the end of that season, flying with the jackdaw's tail. This is a preparation which I did last year. Again, juvenile blackbird, which was a casualty to a neighbour's window, and a sparrowhawk that was brought to me. And this sparrowhawk had got an injury to its wing. And I'll just talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But again, you can see that I've made this bit more of an elaborate display. The sparrowhawk is actually tackling the blackbird, and this is the sort of thing which you might well see in your garden. So I thought I'd build it up around a garden and the flower bed. So I've bought some silk pansies here, and also this plant here, and plant here.
Cyclamen.
Cyclamen, that's right, and some ivy and some artificial grass. And then the soil, to get that looking right, you can see it a little bit better here. What I found the best way to do this is to go underneath the arch of a car, the wheel arch of a car, and scrape off the fine soil which has been thrown up from the roadside, which, if you do it at the right time, is nice and dry. Collect that, mix it with PVA adhesive, and then use it rather like a plasterer would plaster a wall, and lay that down on a piece of plywood base. And then what I do is sprinkle a few larger pieces of soil and debris that I picked up from the garden once I've dried it out. And then I put a light spray of PVA glue over the top so that it will bond to the soil. And it makes quite a convincing backdrop. Now, I mentioned that that sparrowhawk had got a broken wing and had died as a consequence. This isn't a radiograph of that sparrowhawk. I haven't any longer got the X-ray set, but this is a red-tailed buzzard that I had. It was given to me by somebody who really wanted to pass it on. As you know, it's a non-indigenous species used by falconers. They wanted to pass it on to home it, and I agreed to take it on because I hadn't got a falcon at that time, and I thought red-tailed buzzard would be interesting. And I was flying it at rabbits, and we were on a large hillside which ran down across a field to a railway embankment. And one of the rabbits bolted out of its hole across that field to the railway line. And alongside the railway line is fencing, and it just consisted of 3 strands of wire at various heights. And my poor old redtail dropped its legs to grab the rabbit as it ran under the lower stretch of wire, and it hit its leg against the wire. And I was back up on the hillside, and I heard the whack from there. And this is its tibia and fibula. And what's happened is it's fractured the tibia just below the tibial plateau. And here's part of the tibia, and then here's the other part of the tibia main plateau. So it's been displaced slightly. And what I've done here is I've plastered it up, then x-rayed it to make sure that there's reasonable alignment. And you can see the fracture site there. And then again, this is not such a good radiograph. At this point, I think the bird was probably still in shock because it didn't move about so much. So I just had it stood on a perch and propped the x-ray plate up alongside its leg. But it was fidgeting around here a lot more. But this is 10 days later. And although you can still, where this spur of the fracture is off to one side here, you can still see a little bit of that. But actually, there is union of the fracture taking place. And this was sturdy enough, as you can see. I've taken off the plaster cast, and literally the bird's bones heal in the space of about 10 days. And quite a lot of the specimens that I've had, particularly amongst the birds of prey, have got healed fractures. And some of these may well have been birds that have been rehabilitated after being picked up with the fracture, but some of them, I've got no doubt, actually had a fracture in the wild, were fit enough to be able to survive the time taken for the fracture to heal. And in the sparrowhawk that I showed you previously, the fracture was to the ulna, which is the smaller of the radius and ulnar bones that we call our forearm. And that probably could have limped around for some while and may have been lucky enough to come across some carrion which it could feed on, and could possibly survive until that healed. And the radius would have provided a bit of a splint for the ulna, so it could possibly survive that fracture and go on to fly well enough to be able to hunt. Won't happen every time, but it does happen often enough for you to see it as a common enough feature amongst those birds brought into you for taxidermy. I mentioned about the Article 10 licenses and the fact that the law has changed a bit now. I have to apply for a sort of personal Article 10 license in order to sell some of my specimens. You can see this is for another goshawk, which I did back in 1973 with my reference number at that time for that particular bird being DP34. And I applied for this license a few years back to sell it. And this is where they let me know they got no record of this. They don't keep the records. So I'd have to prove that I got the bird legally. And thankfully I was able to track down the guy who gave me the goshawk originally, and I was given an Article 10 license. Cost me £31, and you have to do this for every single license you apply for. And I'm still waiting 2 months after having made the application for that sparrowhawk for the Article 10 to come through. Going on a bit here to some personal sort of history with regard to how I got into taxidermy. I was taken by my grandparents, who originally lived in London as a sort of 6 or 7 year old, to look at various museums. And I'd always been fascinated with the stuffed birds and animals in places like the Natural History Museum. And I eventually ended up with one of my specimens in the Science Museum. I was working with the Defence Academy, and for some reason they'd contacted us about exhibits they were wanting for the welcome wing of the Science Museum, which was going to be called Digitopolis. And they wanted examples of how the digital world was evolving. And they asked if they'd got anyone who would be interested in putting together an exhibit. Well, a colleague and I had the idea of producing various items which utilized the sort of digital technology, microchips of various types in their modern makeup. And we produced a device which, as one of the exhibits, had a sparrowhawk that I stuffed. This one had been in the deep freeze for a long time, but it was about the right sort of size bird for me to mount up. And before I skinned and prepared it, put in one of these microchips, the sort of thing that they used for tracking individual specimens. You can have your dog, your cat, anything these days microchipped to make it easier to identify it should it be stolen. And so I provided the stuffed specimen and a radiograph with the chip in situ of the bird before I stuffed it. And this, along with a number of other items from things like microwaves and kettles and tracking devices for vehicles and so on, was part of the display. And the idea was the specimen would come up on a big circular wheel in front of a viewing station, and the youngster would have to do, or the adult, for instance, but it was aimed mainly at children, would have to decide whether it employed any form of digital technology, and they had to press a button, yes or no. When they pressed the button, what would then come up in a neighboring screen was a radiograph of the object with the microchip or other digital technology in situ. And in this case, it was the sparrowhawk. And as you saw from the invitation, this was the welcome room was opened by the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. And whilst I wasn't introduced to them, what I was pleasantly surprised by was that as we walked the steps to go in, there was a big display talking about the Digitopolis, and it got my name and my colleague's name up there, thanking us for our contribution. And I thought, of all the people who contributed there, they went and picked us out. What a really nice surprise, given that my sort of grandparents had really fostered my interest in this. And to finish on that sort of more pleasant note, I thought I'd bring in this other application for the sort of work that I often do with my stuffed specimens. And this here is, as you can see, a juvenile kestrel. And my neighbour had kestrels nesting at the bottom of their garden. And I went down on a couple of occasions just to see, you know, what was happening. And I went down one day and this youngster was running around on the ground here. And I thought, oh, this is not good. The nest is way up in a conifer. Foxes come through here regularly. I don't want to leave it on the ground. So I made up this little box and put the chick into the box on top of this arrangement, set up my wildlife camera and left it there, hoping that the parents would come down and feed it. Each evening for 2 evenings, I went down to check on it and the camera. The camera showed me that that first day the parents hadn't been in to feed it, or hadn't been down to feed it. So I gave it some food. I'd got a couple of mice in the freezer, so I defrosted them. And it was keen enough to feed on its own once I'd started it off by offering it a few pieces on forceps. And for 2 days, it got no food from the parents. Each of those evenings, I gave it a feed to keep it going. On the 3rd day, I thought, no, it's probably better that I take it home and look after it myself. So I took it back up to the house, and over a period of a week or so, I fed it and kept it going. Now, this takes me right back to about 1971, and this photograph is of a little puppet that I made of a peregrine. And this is Leonard Hurrell's hand here, and he's feeding this young peregrine chick. In the background, you can see a tape recorder. We were playing the calls of adult peregrines and feeding this chick on bits of meat. This was one of the first peregrines to be bred in captivity. Now, the purpose of this puppet is obviously to make sure that we don't imprint ourselves or get imprinted on the chick. The idea was not to be releasing these into the wild at that stage. The idea was to try and build up a breeding population, but nonetheless we wanted the birds to behave as wild birds so that they would breed naturally. And so when I'd got any young irises like this to feed, I'd bring out one of my stuffed specimens. And this is one of the kestrels that I have, a male kestrel. And I use that to feed this young chick. And you can see here he's feeding a bit hungry despite having a relatively full crop, and goes over and starts calling to the stuffed bird for food. And that way I was able to make sure that it didn't get too imprinted on me. And in the daytime, I would, if I wasn't around, I'd pop him into the box which I'd got on the side of my garage. The idea being that this would be a sort of like a hack box, and I would open up the front, and he could come and go, taking food as and when he wanted it. Until he'd got to the stage where I felt that he was sufficiently fit and well developed to go totally free. I actually would put him during the daytime on a long line, and I had a carabiner onto this washing line going across here, and he could fly up onto the roof of the garage. He could fly up onto the roof of my house, and he quite often used to sit in the guttering like this. Because it was my next door neighbour who had the nest, the siblings would fly up here once they'd fledged. And so one evening, I had him loose in the garden on numerous occasions, but he'd not gone off. But on this one evening, one of the siblings flew over, he took off, and the two of them went up on the saw. It was a beautiful sunny evening. They went up on the saw and went off over to the east, circled round to the north, and then it looked as though he was going to come back into my garden. He did a low pass, and then along with his sibling, they disappeared down to the south, and I never saw him again, or I don't think I did. About a year later, I was out in the garden doing some gardening, and bear in mind that I was keeping jesses on him, and he went off before I'd taken the jesses off. I didn't expect him to go off quite so early. I was out doing the gardening, and a kestrel landed on a telegraph pole fairly close by, and it stayed there for 20 minutes. And I sat down and watched it, and I just thought, I wonder. Anyway, when it eventually took off, it did look as though it had the remnants of one jess on its leg. So I like to think that it was him, and he just sort of passed by and thought, oh, that looks familiar. Whether it actually was or not, I can't be certain, because it was only an impression of a jess. It may be that he got a bit of grass attached to his leg, or maybe even worse, picked up some twine somewhere and it was tangled around his leg. But I like to think it was his jess. I think hopefully that had a happy ending too. So hopefully I'm not too far over time, and we can move to some questions if it's not too late.
Yeah. Thank you, Don. We're running a little bit later than usual, but I'm sure if there are any questions, people will hang on for a while. Does anybody have a question that they want to ask? Well, go on then, Anna. You'll have to unmute.
Yeah. I understood how you bought the formers for inside, but I'm still slightly confused as to how did you make them the body shape when you'd taken the skin off? I mean, did you?
Well, you use that when I showed you the picture of the stoat and you saw the complete body laid out.
Yes.
You take measurements around the thorax, around the abdomen. I don't know your background, but whenever these days a woman is pregnant, they have ultrasound scans done.
Yep.
And certainly one of the things they very often do is measure the crown rump length to see how the baby's developing lengthwise. So you do the same thing on these. What's the total length? What's the diameter at various points?
Right.
And then you make up that, just a cylinder really,
Yes.
which replicates the subtle shape of the body. You put leg wires through that, and then you wrap cotton wool or maybe tow or plumber's hemp around those wires. And again, you use the original fleshy leg as a reference point to see whether or not it needs to be, a centimetre in diameter, or if it's a larger animal, 5 or 6 centimetres in diameter.
Right.
Right.
Thank you.
Have we got any more? Something I was wondering, Don, you were saying you quite often keep the skull.
Yes,
Presumably you have to remove the brain and contents before you pack it
yes.
out, do you? I mean, I know this is perhaps a bit gruesome, but how do you go about doing that?
Well, it's pretty easy, really, because I'm not going to retain the cervical vertebra to
Mm,
make up the neck. I'm going to put a wire into the skull. What
mm,
I do is usually cut a hole into the occiput, so the base of the skull,
yeah,
and down underneath around the mandibles, and you can lift out that section of the base of the skull, and then using forceps and some cotton wool, the brain, obviously, unlike the specimens that you might have seen in a sort of medical museum, they're
mm,
not solid. It's
no,
just like blancmange, so you can scoop it out quite easily with a bit of cotton wool on the end of forceps. You can scoop it out and then wash the cavity out again with some heavily salinized water, and that will then ensure that it's going to be preserved if there are any little bits of flesh left.
yeah,
Most likely what will be left in there is part of the meninges, and these are the three layers that surround the the brain, and between the dura mater, which is the outer layer of these three meninges, um, there's a bit of a cavity which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid to cushion the brain against shock. And so very often when you're cleaning the skull, you'll leave that much more fibrous meninge in place. It adheres to the skull bone quite strongly in places. So that's the reason why you want to rinse round the cavity with a bit of salinized water to make sure that it's going to preserve that, and that won't sort of rot away
okay,
before it dries out properly.
yeah,
Because if you pack the skull with, or the cranial cavity with the car body filler or clay, then you're still leaving that damp
yeah,
meninges
yeah.
against the skull, and it'll take a while for it to dry out. So if you don't treat it, it could start to decay and give rise to some pretty foul smells.
And one other thing about you said you'd received a specimen that someone had kept in a room for, was it 12 days, did you say? I
Well,
mean,
more like 3 weeks.
oh, 3 weeks. What is the sort of reasonable time that you can pick things up and they're
um,
still sort of serviceable in terms of preserving them?
Well, there's a couple of things which are useful indicators. So if we ignore temperature, first of all, the ambient temperature, I would look at the eyes, and
Mhm.
if the outer surface of the eye, the cornea, has started to cave in, but is still moist, then it's probably fresh enough. If that has dried out and you can see flies' eggs around the eyes,
Mm,
and if you part the feathers, you see that flies have laid eggs elsewhere,
yeah.
then you're starting to get to that dubious level. Um, so there is some signs like that, but really it's the temperature. On a hot day, if something is hit by a car, should we say at 7 a.m. in the morning due to rush hour traffic, and you happen to go past at 4 p.m., then on a hot day, you'll probably find that the skin started to slip around the eyes and on the abdomen, and you may well find that it's too late. But during the winter, on a reasonably cool day, the next day may even be 2 days. So it's a question of trial and error, really. You see something, it doesn't obviously smell, then pick it up, put it into the deep freeze, pass it on to a taxidermist. And there are some formulas now which many of them use to treat the skins to stop them slipping if they are that little bit too old. And that's the term that's used to describe the way the outermost layer of skin containing the feather and the fur will slip away from the underlayer of skin, just
Right.
leaving you with what looks like a bare patch.
Oh.
And as a professional taxidermist, they would want to try and get away with preparing any specimen that comes along, because if somebody brings it to them, it's an income. As far as I'm concerned, unless it was something exotic, I would think, no, it's not worth that extra effort. It's not going to look as good, and I run the risk of it not working anyway. If I had endless time, then I would experiment a bit more. But unfortunately, I'm one of these people who's got quite a few different hobbies, and so I find that there's always something waiting in the wings. And people say, "Oh, you're an experienced taxidermist," and I'd say, well, I've got a fair bit of experience, but I'm not an expert by any means, and I sort of feel that's me generally. I'm a jack of all trades and an expert of none. It's something that probably I ought to explore more, but circumstances up until now meant that I used to rush most of my taxidermy jobs. I'd fit them in. I'd be working until perhaps 4 in the morning to try and get it done, and then be going into my normal day job at sort of 7:30, 8 o'clock. So I didn't mess around too much. I've got more time now, but then, as many people who are retired will tell you, that you often wonder how you manage to fit everything into a working day, let alone you know, some of the hobbies you've acquired in retirement.
Oh, yeah. Do we have any more questions, or is it time for us to go and watch Countdown?
Can I briefly
Go on,
tell
Andy.
Don something and then ask him a question?
Yeah, yeah.
A while ago, Don, I published a monograph on the history of the marsh warbler. One of the key characters in the story in the 1920s was a taxidermist in Gloucester by the name of Alfred Thomas. And he had a little shop off Westgate Street. And he sort of got in touch, or was put in touch, with the National Museum and Galleries of Wales in Cardiff, and he did various things for them on contract, one of which was stuffing a polar bear.
Oh, wow.
And he actually borrowed some factory space off a guy who made fabrics and did leather tanning and stuff like this to be able to cope with it. But he actually skinned and stuffed a number of marsh warblers, and there are just a very few that still exist. I was able to go down to the Booth Museum at Brighton and see two of these birds. They dug them out from the bottom of a cupboard to show me, and they were taken near Stonehouse in 1923. So they feature in the book, which was really nice to make that contact with Alfred Thomas as a character. And I've actually got a photograph of him as well.
All right.
The question I wanted to ask, have you ever stuffed a fish? How's that done?
I have. I've done only 2 fish, and I've used the traditional technique. Both of these I did back in, again, the late 70s. One was a 3-foot long pike, which a young lad had caught and wanted it stuffed because it was a nice big fish. And the other was the British record of a gilt-head bream. And the way I approached this, in both cases, these individuals did not want what had become now the norm, for a cast to be made, and then you paint that cast. So people would use things like dental alginate to take an impression, and then they'd use a resin to make the cast, and then they'd paint it. And these people wanted the fish. They did not want to show a resin cast. And so you go in through the non-display side, which will be against the wall,
Right.
cut along the back, skin it out as you would anything else, taking all the flesh back. Then, and this is the hazardous part, I had to get hold of benzene to degrease it. You can only get hold of that by license because it's highly carcinogenic, but I was able to get hold of some, and because again, working with hospitals and laboratories, it's possible. So I put the skin into the benzene to thoroughly degrease it, and then after that had taken place, I layered up the inside of the skin with tissue paper and wallpaper glue to make the equivalent of papier mâché layers,
Right.
and then stuffed it with damp silver sand, not any red sand because it will stain the fish, and then started to sew up the back. You put a wooden block inside to give you a basic point of attachment eventually. So I just made sure I could get that in there. And then you put it in a dry place, warm, dry place for the skin to dry out thoroughly. And I put it in my mother's airing cupboard. And then every day, to make sure it doesn't shrink, you pack more damp sand in. And eventually it all dries out. You then tip the sand out because it's dry, it will run out. You make sure that your wooden former or support is amply supported against the papier mâché inner layer. And then you finally sew the last of the wound up. And that wooden former coming out the back, you can screw to your back plate, which will be the back part of the whole display. And then you've got to settle down and paint the fish. Now, in the original sort of taxidermist days, the very good taxidermists painted every individual scale to get a really lifelike reproduction of the original colors. But these days, with spray guns and very careful work, you can make a very good job of it anyway. And the irony of it is that the individual will be looking at the painted surface, which is what they'd be looking at with a cast, is a painted surface. But in their minds, it's still the original fish. So it sits easier with them. And it's a long process. And I wasn't entirely happy with the outcomes because I have to say that despite my best efforts, there was still a little bit of wrinkling of the skin. But they were happy with it. It was their fish. So certainly, unlike the woman with the peacock, there was no argument about the fee involved. They were happy to pay the money and take the fish away.
Very good, thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Don. I think we ought to draw to a close and let you have a rest now. You've done a lot of talking there. So
Right, I've got a bit of a dry throat, I must admit.
I've got to admit, I found that absolutely fascinating, and I think it was my enjoyment of dissection at university that made me realize how much I enjoyed handling live birds. And it's that getting up close and seeing the small detail, and finding out things. I particularly enjoy the breeding season, when you can see what stage of the breeding season birds are at
Yes.
by looking at them closely. And you've got this sort of enjoyment from looking at animals closely as well when you're preparing them for mounts, and I can thoroughly understand that level of enjoyment and satisfaction of learning a bit about the animals as well. And you've certainly conveyed that to us this evening, that you had a lifelong hobby that when you said you weren't an expert or anything, I totally disagree with you. I think you showed incredible expertise, and your specimens look so lifelike and brilliant. I was as impressed tonight as I was at your house when I saw some of the others, you know, and absolutely stunning stuff. So I think we've been really fortunate to have you talking to us about this aspect of natural history that we don't very often get to hear about. So it has been absolutely fascinating, and thank you very, very much for this evening. So if we could give a little round of applause, everybody. It's not very good on Zoom,
Well,
but
thank you
it's
very
there.
much.
Yeah.
No, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and yeah, if anybody at any time has got anything that they would like to have worked on, I'd always either, if I don't feel that I can do it justice, I could refer you to somebody who I feel would be able to. So, but yes, always pleased to be able to help out if at all possible.
Well, ironically, since I last saw you, I've been watching the road quite closely, and I haven't seen a single decent specimen by the side of the road since I last spoke to you. But I am on the watch. Don't you worry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks, Don.
Right.
Good night.
Good night,
You
all.
deserve a
Good night.
rest.
Bye.
Thank you, Don.
Goodbye.
Bye. There. Mike, have you gone? No.
Mervyn,
Don't
I'm,
go.
no, I'm still here.
um. The weather's not ideal tomorrow.
It doesn't honestly look very good tomorrow.
No, so whereas there does look a good day probably on Sunday, if not Saturday. So are you,
Sunday looks quite good, doesn't it?
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So I mean, even if you haven't got your car back, I'll pick you up on Sunday.
Okay. Well, the Lord willing, I ought to have it back by Sunday,
Yeah,
so we'll
okay.
see.
Well, we'll
Yeah.
talk on the phone before then anyway. So
Okay. Right.
all
Okay.
right.
Right. Good night.
Good night. See you, Mike. Bye.